Hi, I'm Warwick Bishop and welcome to my podcast and videocast station. Today I'm delighted to have back Fiona Fu, a general and interventional cardiologist with an interest in women's cardiovascular issues, sports cardiology, climate change and cardiovascular disease. We've already shared one podcast where we spoke extensively about air pollution, particulate matter, emissions and the impact on health. So I'm super excited to pick that up where we were about to talk about traffic and what we can do in the traffic and understand more about it. Fiona, thanks so much for joining me again.
Thank you. No, it's always a pleasure.
Fiona, we spoke about emissions, we spoke about bushfires, we spoke about particulate matter and how that gets into the bloodstream. We even touched on microplastics getting into the bloodstream and within arteries. We're not going to dive down that rabbit hole, as fascinating as it might be. We're going to start with traffic because that's what we didn't have time for last time. And everyone who's listening to this in any significant sized city would have an opinion about traffic, but you tell me a little bit about traffic in the cardiovascular space and pollutant space.
Yeah, so I think again, what's important to know is that, I mean, it's not just heart disease, but traffic-related air pollution is a significant cause of death as well as increasing heart attack mortality, so deaths from heart attacks. And they did a modelling study which did show that in Australia, traffic-related air pollution probably contributes to more than 11,000 deaths, like altogether, and more than 12,000 cardiovascular disease hospitalizations. So this was a study that was modeled off a New Zealand study. But essentially, and the problem in Australia is also that traffic, like so personal emissions, traffic emissions are about 10% of Australia's emissions. So, and it is the fastest growing source of emissions. So they've got bad effects on the health, but they also have bad effects on the environment. So what can you do? So, I mean, ultimately, electric vehicles don't have exhaust. But in the meantime, the other thing is, trying not to travel when you're, when there's a lot of traffic. One thing we were chatting about, which I think is really important, is something called idle off, which is where people idle their cars, when they're waiting for something, particularly, and our concern particularly was because we have kids, is that people idle their cars in front of the kids' pickup lines, and they're the worst people to be exposed to traffic related air pollution because they've got immature lungs. So one of the kind of initiatives that we're trying to kind of get going is something called idle off, where people switch their engines off. Every time you stop your car, you should switch your engine off. You shouldn't be leaving your car engine on in front of a school, in front of anywhere, because it's just wasting petrol, to be honest. And you're causing other people around you to inhale. So, it's equivalent to like, lighting up a cigarette next to a non-smoker, really. So that's one thing. Obviously, electric vehicles, don't have emissions. So that would be the other thing. The other thing, which I think is important, is about active transport. So that will save a lot of emissions. So active transport is when you walk or cycle to work rather than use your car, but even like using more public transport. So you've got less vehicle emissions in general. And you also have that incidental exercise when you're using public transport, has also been shown to not only reduce air pollution, reduce emissions, but also been shown to reduce cardiovascular disease because of that reduced exposure of traffic-related pollution.
Fiona, I'm aware that there are some car manufacturers who already have an idle-off type technology, so it can't be that far away from being broadly utilised. I would imagine that a legislative change by our leaders could actually implement that fairly effectively, fairly quickly, I would have thought.
Yeah, and that's is interesting. So far, not in Australia, but in the UK, I think in London, as well as in New York, there are places where you cannot idle your car. So in the cities, there are idle-free zones where you can't idle the car. Actually, I was at the zoo the other day, and they had a big sign where the buses stop, and they said, switch your engine off,
Yeah,
which I
right.
thought was great. Yeah, but it hasn't been like kind of fully enforced in Australia yet. And I mean, that's something we would hope to try to do, but it takes a lot of effort to do that. There's definitely interest in it. In the just for fun, it was the person who promoted it was Billy Idol.
Yeah, right. Is that right?
Yeah.
I was going to say, probably it needs a champion, almost certainly needs a champion, and almost certainly needs someone in government who's open to make some changes. But it certainly sounds like a great idea and just common sense. Look,
cool. Yeah.
While we were talking about traffic in general, I just wondered if there's a particular culprit. Do we see those diesel vehicles as more of a problem than petrol vehicles? Do we see the trucks that blow out a bit of smoke as greater sinners than a small petrol car? Are there still, obviously there's more small petrol cars. Is there any way of thinking about those? Do we see them as different? Obviously they're different types of.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I don't know. I know diesel traffic definitely has been shown to be particularly toxic. So presumably the bigger exhaust, this is why the big four-wheel drives and the big trucks, they definitely, pump out more traffic pollution. The other thing to note with traffic-related air pollution is that we were talking about PM 2.5. They also have ultrafine particles, which are difficult to measure, but they're worse because they go in even more. Because they're smaller, they go in even further than the PM 2.5 particles.
Okay. Well, look, it was fantastic to cover some of that information around that air pollution, emissions, traffic. But what I was also keen to do, because these two podcasts that you've helped out with are around climate change and environment. I'd like to talk about climate change a little bit, and in particular, sort of the weather extremes and cardiovascular health, hot and cold, I guess.
Yeah. So I think this is the bigger issue. And I think definitely the extreme heat. Extreme heat is, as we all know, is increasing, and we're getting more and more heat waves. Heat waves, they're silent killers in Australia. It kills more people than any other natural disaster combined. And the primary cause of death during a heat wave is from a cardiovascular event. So heat is extreme heat. So is an important cause of death, but it's also an important cause of cardiovascular disease, death from cardiovascular disease, but also an important cause of heart attacks, as well as strokes, as well as heart failure, and as well as arrhythmias. Okay, so like sudden cardiac death and irregular heart rhythms. So it is very important, and particularly with heat waves, the greater the intensity of the heat waves, the greater the risk as well. So you've got extreme heat temperatures, but then you've also got prolonged heat waves where you've got high temperatures for several days. That it increases cardiovascular disease. The other thing to add in addition to that, apart from just the temperature itself, is the humidity. So like both high and low humidity, but particularly I think high humidity with extreme heat increases your risk of cardiovascular disease death, as well as if you had low green coverage. And then the other thing is with air pollution. So we're talking about bushfires earlier. So if you combine heat extreme heat as well as bushfires, which is what happens because with extreme heat, you're going to get bushfires. Then those effects are what we call synergistic, meaning that the joint effect is greater than the two individual effects. And so that's really important to know. And, we're affected a lot in Australia because we've got the summers with, extreme heat as well as fires. And then you've got those additive effects of on cardiovascular disease, mortality and morbidity. So hospitalizations. Yeah.
So one of those striking figures there, Fiona, was that significant temperature events account for more deaths than any other natural disaster. That's a striking.
Heat waves, in Australia. Yeah.
Striking. I wouldn't have guess that. And I guess as you were sharing, I was trying to think, who are the people at risk? Well, of course, some elderly and frail people who are maybe trying to get to the shops, but I know there are also quite a lot of athletes, often
Yes.
athletes who are, for want of a better term, if you're listening, it's not a derogatory label, but there are weekend warriors who'll go out and really pound the pavement or pedal hard with their lycra on and really try and get a week's worth of exercise on one of their weekend stints. And I just wonder if you've got any insights into the sort of individuals who are greatest at risk during these times.
Yeah, so athletes I'll go into in a second, but what you said, so it's elderly and as well as young and pregnant ladies, but it's those with underlying chronic disease. So anyone with heart disease, lung disease, renal disease, they all have an increased risk. The other one is mental health. So when it's hot, mental health disorders significantly increase. So admissions with mental health also significantly increase. So they're the ones that are most vulnerable. Also, the people who can't afford, like the low socioeconomic, who can't afford air conditioning and who can't, who do not have the ability. But these are the vulnerable groups, and then outdoor workers are the other big group. Okay. And then we talk about athletes. So yes, it's those ones who, maybe weekend warriors, but the other ones are the ones who do, like, we're such a sporting nation. Everyone who's doing outdoor sports, like all the individuals, anytime there's an outdoor event and all the outdoor training and it's heat, they're all exposed to that. And there was a paper published about a month ago in the lead up, because Brisbane's getting the Olympics and because the Olympics are going on in Paris, and it's hot in the Northern Hemisphere at the moment, right? So all of these athletes are at significant risk of heat-related illness, which can be as bad as something called heat stroke, which cause severe neurological disability and then like death. So I think it's important because first of all these sporting places have to recognize these heat-related illnesses that they can get when they're training or when they're playing the games, and the organizations also have to have the ability to move them to different times or reschedule as well. And then the other people who are vulnerable are the spectators and the volunteers. So that they make the point that, if you're watching a cricket game, because I think there was like a test cricket match in Perth one year and it was significantly hot, like, it was so hot outside and you're watching there for hours, you're in the sun, those people need to be advised about what to do and how to keep themselves cool in those situations. So so that's important to know, that everyone is vulnerable, but some people are more vulnerable. And just because you're young doesn't mean you can't have heat stroke, you can't have any of all these heat-related illnesses, which I think is important for those athletes. For example, the Sydney Marathon that was done last year, they started a bit later. They started at maybe, I think, 9 or 10, but the temperature was already more than 20 degrees then. Okay, so that meant that there are about 7 people that had to be taken to hospital for heat-related illness in the Sydney Marathon. And so, moving the time to earlier and things like that, as well as having other things like ice baths, etc., and keeping cool during the race is really important.
I'm guessing, obviously, things like hydration as well as keeping cool are outrageously important.
Yes.
Look, just a question from a lack of knowledge in the space. Does keeping hydrated protect you from sort of heat trauma, overheating, this sort of
I mean, I think, definitely you have to keep, definitely it's, I think with everyone, we like during heat waves, I tell every patient they should be drinking at least 2 liters of water a day anyway, and then more in those heat, in those hotter conditions. With athletes, it's water, but it's also electrolytes because they'll also lose salt. So you also have issues with hyponatremia, but yeah, definitely lots and lots of water, and more than you're losing, kind of thing. Essentially, keeping cool, so having lots of cold towels around you. Are we talking about athletes, or do you want me to talk about just general?
Look, we're just in general.
Yeah.
I think we can talk about hypothermia in athletes on another occasion if need be. But as soon as we start talking about heat, keeping hydrated, you and I know that our patients with cardiac failure who are often difficult to get their fluid balances just right, this throws another spanner into the works and really it really necessitates significant consideration. What's your experience there, Fiona?
Yeah, so I think one thing that is recommended, and I think it's important that all these patients, these cardiac patients, I mean, apart from the heart failure patients, you've also got patients on antihypertensives as well. So I think prior to it becoming warmer, I think it is really important to go through medications and also let the patients have a bit of accountability of measuring their blood pressure as well. So if they notice that it's getting a bit too low, touch base and having to reduce it. Definitely the diuretic, so like things like Lasix, where they make you lose fluid, they need to be looked at and just carefully maybe even reduced. But you don't want to take people off their heart failure medications, the four pillars of good medications, and you still need to make sure they drink enough but not drink too much. However, my experience is usually that they actually don't drink much anyway. Like I have I have someone who essentially has severe heart failure. She's on all the right medications, but she still has low blood pressure, but she won't drink. Even if you ask her to drink, she won't drink. So she will never reach that, that 1.5 or, whatever restriction that they're on, because she actually just won't even drink a liter. You know what I mean? So I think I don't usually have people drinking too much. But yeah, I'm sure there are people who do. But unless they're kind of critical, I don't think you need to restrict them from drinking. You know what I mean? Like if they're not in acute heart failure, they're not you don't need to restrict their fluid intake. Yeah. But you do need to monitor their medications and their blood pressure and just make them aware of what can happen in the heat, because they're the ones that are going to be more vulnerable to a cardiovascular event during a heat wave.
Certainly, there's no question there can be some real difficulty in not only dealing with these environmental changes, but also patients who are a little bit brittle in their own management of their own medical illness. And I know many years ago, I worked in Darwin as a intern and as a registrar, and it was common knowledge that during the dry season, during the tourist season, we would be inundated with travellers from down south who'd turn up in cardiac failure. They'd come on their bus trip. They'd been very careful with their fluid consumption, but they also hadn't taken their diuretics, so they wouldn't be inconvenienced on the bus.
Yeah.
But everything, as all these moving parts and anyway, look, I'd really like to finish off on one last critical point, and that's climate change and mental health, because I think we often talk about, the arteries, and we talk about the blood pressure, and we talk about the arrhythmias and various other bits and pieces. But at the end of the day, a huge component of our quality of life is our emotional well-being, our mental health. And I would love you to share some of your own experiences and thoughts around climate change and mental health. And that'd be just a wonderful way to wrap this up.
So unfortunately, climate change is a significant, risk factor for mental health. So, all these extreme weather events have been shown to increase mental health disorders, particularly, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then, as we were talking about before, just heat. So heat in itself increases admissions for mental health, worsens people's mental health, worse than suicide, unfortunately. So all these things. And then you've also got the other issue, which is what we call eco-anxiety. So people who are particularly worried about the climate and have that kind of ongoing eco-anxiety about the future of our planet. So, but definitely from a mental health point of view, climate change is a big driver of adverse mental health outcomes. And then, as you know, and mental health is a big risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So, you know, these all things like kind of accumulate. And there was also another paper that showed if you combine air pollution, it also worsens mental health and worsens your cardiovascular disease more than in places that don't have air pollution. And then another big one that your listeners probably know about is Takotsubo. So people presenting, like, you know, they had a presentation of a patient who had had chest pain, who'd lost her house during a flood, and they presented with chest pain and had ST elevation. So looks like she was having a heart attack, but her arteries were normal. And then she had this classic Takotsubo, which is this octopus trap, where her heart function wasn't very good, and so that's like what we call a stress-induced cardiomyopathy, such that and you know, these kind of stressful events would trigger. So I think climate change is a big problem for worsening mental health. And then worsened mental health is a big problem for cardiovascular disease as well. So it's kind of all like, unfortunately, I'm sorry to leave on a slow note, but it is actually quite depressing. Like, it is actually a big problem. Yeah. And it's just going to get worse, unfortunately, you know, and, you know, I don't need to put it lightly, but I guess this is the urgency of, you know, why we are talking about this and why we all need to kind of act and do something. Yeah.
I think it's super important to raise awareness, because we're thinking about it in terms of it impacting what we wear, maybe what the weather's like. But this is really important because it's impacting our health. On top of that, let alone the sustainability of the planet. But while it's impacting our health, we really should be starting to bring the priority greater and greater, because it is more than, you know, we've had a warm summer, isn't that nice? I wonder if it's going to get too hot. It's really going to drive down to how we're going to be able to live on this planet in a sustainable and a healthy way, actually.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Fiona, it's been an absolute delight sharing with you. It really has. Again, I know how busy you are as a cardiologist, because I am one as well. I know how valuable our time is. I know you spread yourself really thin between cardiology, interventional work, but also family and work outside of that. So look, thank you once more for sharing today.
No, thank you for letting me be part of this. No, as I said, I think it is really important to spread the word, and just the knowledge, you know, like awareness of all of this is very important. Yeah, thank you.
Couldn't agree more. For those who are listening, I'm sure you got as much out of this as I did. Just a fantastic bit of information and such important stuff for us to be thinking about. If you've got any queries or questions, drop us a note at info@drwarrickbishop.online. If you are listening to this for the first time, I'd love you to subscribe. I found out the other day I'm dropping in and out of the top 100 medical podcasts in Australia. I would love to drop into the top 50, so if you subscribe, I'd be very grateful. I found I was actually rated number 3 in Botswana, so I'm due for a trip over there to meet my fans. For now, though, I am going to wish you the very best. I hope you live as well as possible for as long as possible. Take care and bye for now.